Hey guys, tonight we're flipping through the pages of the most dangerous instruction manual ever written, one that nobody printed, nobody signed, and nobody admits to following. And yet every single major war in human history has read from it like a script taped to the back of a bathroom door. We're talking about the hidden blueprint behind every major world war. The eerily identical recipe of tangled alliances, inflated egos, arms races nobody can afford, and a special kind of collective amnesia that convinces an entire generation that this time, surely, things will be different. Spoiler, they are not different. They are never different. The ingredients change. Horses become tanks. Telegrams become tweets. But the cookbook stays the same. So settle in, because tonight we're going to walk through that cookbook, page by terrible page, and by the end of it, you'll never look at a peace treaty the same way again. But first, before we crack open the war manual, let's take care of a few things. Before you get comfortable, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment telling me which part of the war blueprint you'd fall for. Would you be the one buying war bonds because the poster was really convincing? The one signing up because your buddy did? Or the one hoarding canned goods in your basement while insisting you saw this coming? Now, dim the lights, switch on a fan for that gentle white noise, and get comfortable. Imagine the fan is the distant hum of a diplomatic telegraph machine, clicking away in some oak-paneled office where a man in a very expensive suit is about to make a very expensive mistake. Let's pause for a moment. Have you ever wondered why every major war starts with somebody saying, "This will be over by Christmas"? Have you ever thought about why countries that trade millions of dollars worth of goods with each other still end up pointing cannons at each other's harbors? Have you ever considered why the people who start wars are almost never the people who fight them, and why nobody seems to find that suspicious? Have you ever wondered what an arms dealer's dining room looks like? Whether there's a chandelier, whether the napkins are linen, whether the wine pairs well with the destruction of a medium-sized European country? Have you ever asked yourself why peace treaties are always signed in palaces instead of in the muddy, rat-infested trenches where the actual dying happened? And have you ever wondered why, after every single war in recorded history, someone stands in the rubble and says, "Never again," and then does it again, almost exactly the same way, roughly 20 to 30 years later? Tonight, we're answering all of it, every last uncomfortable question. Congratulations, you've just woken up in 1910, or 1935, or 1990, or honestly, pick a decade. It doesn't matter, because the room you're in looks suspiciously similar no matter when you are. There's a mahogany desk covered in maps with arrows drawn on them. There's a general somewhere adjusting his medals in a mirror. The air smells like cigar smoke, old paper, and the particular musk of overconfidence. And somewhere, in a factory you'll never visit, someone is building something that will change the shape of the next 10 years of human history. Welcome to the blueprint. You're holding it in your hands. And the first page, as always, says, Step 1, make friends you can't trust. Let's set the scene. You're standing in a room full of maps, not the kind of maps you'd find in a glove compartment or on your phone. These are the real ones. The massive linen-backed affairs pinned to oak boards with little flags stuck into them like cocktail garnishes on a very aggressive appetizer. Every flag represents an alliance. Every dotted line represents a promise. And every promise, you will eventually learn, is about as sturdy as a sandcastle built by a toddler during high tide. This is the Alliance Room, and it exists in every era, in every empire, in every war that ever convinced itself it was different from the last one. The details change. The flags get more colorful. The maps get more accurate. The men standing around them get slightly better haircuts. But the room is always the same. And the conversation is always the same too. It goes something like this. If they attack us, you'll help, right? Followed by, of course. And if they attack you, we'll help. Followed by a handshake that feels firm and trustworthy in the moment, and absolutely catastrophic in retrospect. The alliance system is the first page of the blueprint, and it is, without exaggeration, one of the most elegant traps humanity has ever built for itself. The idea is simple. You make friends, not because you like them. Nobody in international diplomacy actually likes anyone. But because you're afraid of the guy across the border who just bought a very large number of cannons. So, you sign a treaty. And your neighbor signs a treaty with someone else. And that someone else signs a treaty with your rival. And before you know it, the entire continent is connected by a web of mutual obligations so tangled that it looks like someone handed a ball of yarn to a cat and walked away for 6 decades. The beautiful irony, and this is the kind of irony that would be funny if it hadn't killed millions of people, is that the alliance system was designed to prevent war. The logic was impeccable. If everyone is allied with everyone, then attacking anyone means attacking everyone, and nobody is stupid enough to fight the entire world at once. Spoiler, somebody is always that stupid. The problem is that alliances don't just connect countries, they connect egos, they connect pride, they connect the very specific human inability to back down from a fight once you've publicly promised to show up. And so, the system that was supposed to make war unthinkable instead made it inevitable. Because once the first domino falls, every treaty, every handshake, every ink-stained promise on every oak desk in every capital city activates at once, like a Rube Goldberg machine designed by someone who really, deeply hated peace. You can see this in 1914, when the assassination of one archduke in Sarajevo, one man, one bullet, one afternoon, triggered a chain reaction that pulled in Austria-Hungary, then Serbia, then Russia, then Germany, then France, then Britain, then the Ottoman Empire, and eventually, somehow, Japan. All because of the maps. All because of the flags. All because somebody, somewhere, decades earlier, shook hands in a room that smelled like cigars and said, "Don't worry, this is just a precaution." And yet, the people who built these alliances weren't stupid. They were, in fact, some of the most educated, well-traveled, multilingual diplomats the world had ever produced. They spoke 5 languages. They dined at the finest tables in Europe. They had read Machiavelli and Clausewitz, and probably had opinions about both. They simply could not imagine that a system built entirely on trust between people who didn't trust each other might, at some point, collapse, which tells you something about the human capacity for optimism, or possibly about the human capacity for self-deception, which is When you really think about it, the same thing wearing a nicer hat. Let's talk about arms races, because if alliances are the first page of the blueprint, then arms races are the second, and they are written in slightly larger, bolder, more expensive font. An arms race is what happens when one country builds a new weapon and every other country immediately decides that they too need that weapon. Not because they plan to use it, of course, but because they need to make sure the other side knows they could. It's the international equivalent of your neighbor installing a security camera. So you install 2 security cameras. So they install floodlights. So you install a moat. And before long, the entire street looks like a maximum security prison, and nobody remembers what they were originally worried about. The first modern arms race worth studying belongs to the years before World War I, when Britain and Germany decided to compete over who could build the most enormous, most expensive, most hilariously impractical battleships. The British had the Dreadnought, a warship so advanced, so heavily armed, and so absurdly costly that it instantly made every other navy on Earth obsolete, including, somewhat inconveniently, Britain's own. Germany looked at the Dreadnought and said, effectively, "We'll take 12. And Britain looked at Germany's order and said, "Make ours 20. And so began a naval arms race that consumed roughly the GDP of a small continent and produced fleets of ships so massive and so precious that both sides were terrified of actually using them in battle. Because losing even one would be like flushing a city's entire annual budget down a very large, very salty toilet. This pattern, build, match, escalate, panic, build more, is not unique to battleships. It shows up in the 1930s with tanks and aircraft. It shows up in the Cold War with nuclear weapons, which took the concept of "we need more than they have" and applied it to devices capable of ending civilization, which is arguably the most committed anyone has ever been to a bad idea. It shows up in the cyber age with surveillance technology, drone programs, and weapon systems controlled by algorithms that make decisions faster than any human could, which is reassuring in exactly the way that a self-driving car with no brakes is reassuring. The arms race page of the blueprint has one key instruction, and it's always the same. Build until you can't afford to stop. Because the thing about an arms race is that it doesn't have a finish line. There's no point at which both sides look at their arsenals and say, "Yes, this seems like enough." There's always a newer model, a bigger bomb, a faster jet, a quieter submarine, and the spending becomes self-justifying. You need the new weapon because the other side might get the new weapon. And if they get it first, then all the money you spent on the old weapon was wasted. And nobody wants to explain that to the taxpayers. So you keep building. And they keep building. And somewhere, a factory worker is pulling a 12-hour shift assembling something she hopes will never be used, while a general is pulling a 12-hour shift planning exactly how to use it. And in the middle of all this, there's always a rat. Not a metaphorical rat, an actual one, scurrying along the factory floor or nesting in the supply room of a naval dockyard, completely indifferent to the geopolitical implications of the steel beams being welded above its head. The rat doesn't care about deterrence theory. The rat has found a very nice piece of bread near the boiler room and considers the day a success. In a world of escalating madness, the rat is, honestly, the only one with a sensible perspective. Let's talk about money, because behind every page of the war blueprint, there is a ledger, and the ledger is always in the black for someone. War is expensive, historically, cosmically, soul-crushingly expensive. The kind of expensive that makes your credit card bill look like a rounding error. And yet, and this is the part that makes the blueprint so persistent, war is also, for a very specific and very small group of people, extraordinarily profitable. The economics of war are simple enough that you could explain them to a child, and disturbing enough that you probably shouldn't. Step 1. A government decides it needs weapons. Step 2. It contracts with private companies to build those weapons. Step 3. Those companies hire workers, buy raw materials, build factories, and produce an enormous quantity of things designed to destroy other things. Step 4. The government pays for all of it with taxes or bonds or debt or some creative combination of all three. Step 5. The weapons are used, which means they are destroyed, which means more weapons are needed, which means the contracts continue, which means the factories keep running, which means the money keeps flowing. It is, in a grim and entirely unintentional way, the most reliable economic stimulus program ever devised. The people who benefit from this cycle are not, generally speaking, the ones doing the fighting. They are the ones selling the steel, the gunpowder, the uniforms, the rations, the transport ships, the medical supplies, and, in a twist that would be darkly comedic if it weren't so consistent, often selling to both sides simultaneously. During World War I, there were companies that supplied materials to Allied and Central Power nations. At the same time, through a network of subsidiaries and neutral country intermediaries, so elaborate that it would make a modern tax lawyer weep with admiration. During World War II, certain American corporations continued doing business with German firms well into the late 1930s, and some maintained financial relationships through Swiss intermediaries, even after hostilities began. The blueprint doesn't have a chapter titled, "Make sure someone gets rich," but it doesn't need one. The profit motive is baked into every other page like yeast in bread, invisible, essential, and responsible for making the whole thing rise. And here's the part that makes this chapter of the blueprint particularly resilient. The people who profit from war are also the people who fund political campaigns, own newspapers, sponsor think tanks, and employ lobbyists, which means that the economic engine of war is not just self-sustaining. It is self-defending. It has armor. It has PR. It has a seat at the table where decisions about war and peace are made, and it always orders the steak. Of course, the factory worker pulling the late shift doesn't see any of this. She sees her paycheck, which is better than it was last year. She sees the "Help Wanted" sign in the window, which means her cousin can get a job. She sees the newspaper headline about national security, and she feels, in some vague and unexamined way, that she's doing her part. The rat in the factory corner sees none of it either. The rat has found a second piece of bread. The rat is having the best week of its life. Let's talk about propaganda, because if the blueprint is a cookbook, then propaganda is the seasoning, the thing that makes every terrible ingredient taste, briefly and deceptively, like patriotism. Propaganda is not lying exactly. It's something more sophisticated and more dangerous than lying. Lying is clumsy. Lying gets caught. Propaganda is the art of telling only certain truths in a certain order, with certain images, to create a certain feeling, and then letting that feeling do the lying for you. Every major war in modern history has been preceded by a propaganda campaign so thorough, so coordinated, and so effective that by the time the first shot is fired, a significant portion of the population genuinely believes that war is not only necessary, but morally imperative. The enemy is not just a political rival. He is a monster. He eats children. He burns churches. He wants to destroy your way of life, your family, your dog, your Sunday roast. And the only thing standing between your dog and total annihilation is your willingness to sign up, shut up, and support the war effort without asking too many inconvenient questions. The tools of propaganda change with technology. In the Napoleonic Wars, it was pamphlets and broadsheets and political cartoons showing the enemy as a grotesque caricature, literally dehumanized on paper before being dehumanized on the battlefield. In World War I, it was posters. Glorious, terrifying, emotionally manipulative posters. Uncle Sam pointing directly at you with an expression that somehow combined fatherly disappointment with military recruitment. Women in flowing white dresses representing liberty or justice or some other abstract concept that looks much better on a poster than in a trench. In World War II, it was radio and cinema. Roosevelt's fireside chats, Churchill's speeches, Goebbels' entire career, which was essentially the world's most sinister marketing department, and in every case, every single case, the propaganda followed the same formula. First, define the enemy. Make him alien. Make him threatening. Make him so fundamentally different from us that the listener begins to feel that coexistence is impossible. Second, define the cause. Make it noble. Make it existential. Make it about something larger than politics, about civilization itself, about the future of your children, about the soul of the nation. Third, define the sacrifice. Make it glorious. Make it temporary. Make it sound like a camping trip with slightly worse food and a very clear return date. It'll be over by Christmas. A short, decisive campaign. A quick surgical strike. These phrases appear in every war, in every language, with the same breezy confidence and the same spectacular inaccuracy. You're lying in bed right now, and your phone is probably within arm's reach. On that phone are algorithms more sophisticated than anything Goebbels could have dreamed of. Algorithms that know what you've clicked, what you've searched, what you've lingered on, what makes you angry, what makes you afraid. The blueprint hasn't updated its propaganda chapter in centuries. It hasn't needed to. The delivery system gets faster, but the message stays the same. They are coming. We must stop them. And you, yes, you specifically, are the only thing standing in the way. Spoiler, you are not the only thing standing in the way. You are one of millions, and the people writing the posters know your name about as well as the rat in. The factory knows the CEOs. Let's talk about the diplomat, because every version of the blueprint has one, and he is always the same person wearing a different century's suit. The diplomat is the man, and historically, it is almost always a man, because the blueprint was not written with inclusivity in mind, who genuinely believes he can prevent the war. He has spent his career in rooms with leather chairs and crystal decanters. He speaks 4 languages, possibly 5. He has attended dinners in every capital in Europe, and he has opinions about the wine at each one. He knows the foreign minister of the rival nation personally. They've shared brandy, exchanged gifts, sent each other Christmas cards with tasteful winter scenes, and he is absolutely certain, right up until the moment the cannons start firing, that rational conversation between reasonable men can prevent the unreasonable from happening. The diplomat is not a villain. That's what makes him so tragic. He is, in almost every case, genuinely intelligent, genuinely well-intentioned, and genuinely convinced that the system works. He has seen it work before. Crises averted, tensions diffused, strongly worded letters sent and received and filed in cabinets where they will gather dust alongside treaties that actually held. He has a track record. He has references. He has a very nice pen. What the diplomat does not have is any real power over the forces that are, at this exact moment, making his job impossible. He cannot control the arms manufacturer who just landed a contract worth more than the diplomat's entire department budget. He cannot control the newspaper editor who has discovered that war headlines sell 3 times as many copies as peace headlines. He cannot control the general who has spent 20 years planning a campaign and would very much like to see it executed before he retires. And he cannot control the mob, the public, the crowd, the millions of ordinary people who have been reading those newspapers and looking at those posters and listening to those speeches until the idea of war has stopped feeling like a catastrophe and started feeling like a solution. You can picture the diplomat in 1914. His name is Sir Edward Grey, and he is the British Foreign Secretary. He has spent the summer trying to mediate between Austria-Hungary and Serbia, between Russia and Germany, between everyone and everyone. He has sent telegrams. He has made phone calls. He has probably not slept properly in weeks. And on August 3rd, standing at his window in the Foreign Office in London, watching the gas lamps being lit along the Mall, he says, and this is probably the most haunting single sentence spoken by any diplomat in history, something about the lamps going out all over Europe. And he's right. They are going out, and no amount of brandy or Christmas cards or crystal decanters or tasteful winter scenes will turn them back on. The diplomat appears again in the 1930s. This time his name is Neville Chamberlain, and he is holding a piece of paper and smiling, and the piece of paper says, "Peace for our time." And the smile is the smile of a man who has just unknowingly signed the most famous bad contract in human history. And the diplomat appears again in every decade since, in conference rooms and summit halls and UN chambers, always speaking carefully, always believing in the process, and always, eventually, being overtaken by the part of the blueprint that doesn't care about process. And yet, despite everything, despite the futility, despite the track record, despite the absolute certainty that the diplomat will fail, you can't help but admire the effort, because the diplomat is the part of the blueprint that says, maybe this time. And maybe this time is when you strip away all the cynicism, the most fundamentally human sentence ever spoken. Now, let's talk about the general. Because if the diplomat is the blueprint's optimist, the general is its pragmatist. And pragmatism, in the context of war, is a word that does a tremendous amount of heavy lifting. The general does not want war, exactly. What the general wants is to be ready for war, which is a distinction that sounds meaningful in a staff meeting and becomes completely meaningless the moment the first order's given. The general has spent his entire adult life preparing for a conflict that he hopes will never come but secretly suspects, and possibly, in the quiet hours of the night, privately hopes will arrive during his command. Not because he's bloodthirsty, not because he's evil, but because he has a plan. He has spent years developing this plan. He has war-gamed it, refined it, presented it to committees, defended it against skeptics, and filed it in a cabinet with a classification stamp that makes it feel important. The plan is his life's work, and a life's work that never gets used is, in the vocabulary of military careers, a life's work that never existed. The general in 1914 has a plan called the Schlieffen Plan. It is a masterpiece of logistical ambition, a sweeping, precise, timetable-driven invasion of France through Belgium that depends on everything going exactly right and nothing going even slightly wrong. It is, in other words, the military equivalent of planning a surprise birthday party for someone you've never met, in a house you've never visited, during an earthquake. The general in 1939 has a plan called Blitzkrieg. It is faster, more violent, more mechanized, and initially more successful than the Schlieffen Plan, which is the military equivalent of saying the second time you stuck your hand in the fire, you did it with greater efficiency. The general, in every era, has a plan. The plan always assumes that the enemy will behave rationally, that supply lines will hold, that weather will cooperate, that morale will remain high, and that the war will be short. The plan is always wrong about at least 3 of these things, usually all 5. And yet the general is, in his own way, as sympathetic as the diplomat. Because the general knows something the diplomat doesn't. He knows that the blueprint is real, that war is coming, and that someone has to be ready when it arrives. The diplomat believes the system can prevent the fire. The general believes the fire is inevitable and is focused on controlling where it burns. Both of them are right. Both of them are wrong. And both of them will be remembered by history in ways that are, like most things in the blueprint, deeply unfair. Let's talk about the trigger, because this is the part of the blueprint that nobody wants to acknowledge. Every world war, every continent-spanning catastrophe, every millions dead rewriting of the global order begins with something small. Not small in retrospect, small at the time. A man is shot in a car. A border is crossed. A telegram is intercepted. A treaty is violated in a way that could, in theory, be resolved with a sternly worded letter and a diplomatic dinner. But the sternly worded letter doesn't get sent, or it gets sent and ignored, or it gets sent and received and filed in the same cabinet as all the other sternly worded letters that failed to prevent all the other wars. The trigger is never the cause. This is the single most important sentence in the entire blueprint, and it is the one that gets ignored most often. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand did not cause World War I. It triggered it. The cause was everything we've already talked about: the alliances, the arms race, the economic incentives, the propaganda, the generals with plans, the diplomats with hope. The trigger was just the last grain of sand that made the pile collapse. And the blueprint knows this. The blueprint doesn't specify what the trigger will be. It doesn't have to. When you've built a system that's primed to explode, when the alliances are locked, the weapons are loaded, the populations are afraid, the newspapers are screaming, and the generals are pacing, anything can be the trigger. A border incident, a trade dispute, a misinterpreted telegram, a nervous soldier who fires his weapon because he heard a noise that turned out to be a stray dog, or possibly a rat, because the rat from the factory has relatives everywhere, and they are equally indifferent to geopolitical tension. The trigger chapter of the blueprint is always the shortest, and that's the point. The trigger doesn't need to be dramatic. It doesn't need to be proportionate. It just needs to exist. Because the system that the earlier chapters have built is so tightly wound, so heavily loaded, so desperately eager to activate, that the trigger could be almost anything. A duke gets shot, and 20 million people die. A border is crossed, and 60 million people die. The disproportion is not a bug. It's a feature. It's the entire point. The blueprint produces systems so unstable that they will collapse at the first available excuse, and then everyone acts surprised, as if the collapse were the problem, and not the system that made the collapse inevitable. And the rat watches all of this from behind a baseboard, or under a chair, or in the pantry of a diplomatic residence, and chews on something that used to be a treaty, but now tastes, to the rat, indistinguishable from every other piece of paper. Let's talk about what daily life looks like before the blueprint activates, because this is the chapter that makes the whole thing genuinely sad. You're sitting in a cafe. It's a Tuesday. The year is 1913, or 1938, or 1989, or any year in which the blueprint is fully loaded but hasn't yet been triggered. The coffee is adequate. The bread is fresh. The newspaper is full of things that seem important, but also, somehow, far away. There's a headline about a military exercise somewhere. There's a column about trade negotiations. There's an editorial by someone who uses the word inevitable in a way that sounds intellectual rather than terrifying. And you, sitting at your table with your adequate coffee, feel, and this is the key word, normal. Daily life before a world war doesn't feel like daily life before a world war. It feels like daily life. That's the trick. That's the part of the blueprint that's most cruel, because a blueprint doesn't announce itself. There's no alarm, no countdown clock, no flashing sign that says, "Enjoy this while it lasts." There's just Tuesday, and coffee, and a newspaper, and the vague, comfortable assumption that tomorrow will look more or less like today. The people of 1913 Vienna went to the opera. They argued about modern art. They complained about the cost of housing. They worried about their children's education. They had opinions about the new styles of dress and the declining quality of public transit. They were, in every way that matters, us. They were people who had plans. Plans for the summer, plans for the holidays, plans for retirement, plans that assumed continuity, plans that assumed the world would remain, more or less, the shape it was currently in. And then it didn't, and the coffee went from adequate to unavailable, and the bread went from fresh to rationed, and the newspaper went from informative to propaganda. And the plans, the summer trips, the holiday dinners, the retirement gardens, dissolved like sugar in the rain. Here is where you might feel the urge to say, but they should have seen it coming. And in hindsight, yes, the signs were there. The alliances, the arms buildup, the rhetoric, the nationalism. But the signs are always there. That's what makes the blueprint so effective. The signs are there, and life is also there. The coffee, the bread, the Tuesday, and the human brain, faced with the choice between everything is about to change in ways I cannot control, and I think I'll have another cup, chooses the cup. Every single time. We are a species that plans vacations during arms races. We are a species that renovates kitchens during geopolitical crises. We are a species that, faced with the slow, grinding, unmistakable sound of the blueprint activating, turns up the radio and asks someone to pass the sugar. And honestly, you can't blame us. Because the alternative, sitting in your cafe, staring at the wall, fully aware that the world you know is about to be fed into a machine you can't stop, is not something the human mind is designed to sustain. So we drink the coffee, and we read the newspaper, and we trust the diplomats, and we hope the generals stay in their offices. And when the trigger comes, when it finally, inevitably comes, we act surprised. Not because we didn't know, but because knowing and believing are two different countries, and the border between them is, like most borders in the blueprint, poorly defended. Let's talk about mobilization, because this is the moment when the blueprint goes from theory to reality, and reality, it turns out, smells like boot leather and engine oil and the particular sweat of a man who has just been told he's going somewhere he didn't volunteer to go. Mobilization is the word that generals and politicians use to describe the process of turning a nation into a war machine. It sounds clean when you say it in a briefing room. It sounds orderly, methodical, impressive. And at a logistical level, it genuinely is impressive. The sheer organizational achievement of moving millions of men from their homes to their units to their deployment points within a matter of days is, purely as an exercise in project management, one of the most remarkable things human beings have ever accomplished. It is also, purely as a human experience, one of the most devastating. Because mobilization is the moment when everything becomes real. The posters stop being decoration. The speeches stop being background noise. The neighbor's son puts on a uniform and suddenly looks both older and younger at the same time. Older because the uniform ages everyone who wears it. Younger because you remember him borrowing eggs from your kitchen last month, and now he's holding a rifle, and neither of you knows what to say. You're standing at a train station. The year doesn't matter. The country doesn't matter. The platform is packed. There are women holding handkerchiefs. There are children who don't fully understand why everyone is crying, but have decided to cry anyway, because that seems like the thing to do. There are men in new boots that haven't been broken in yet, carrying packs that weigh more than anything they've ever carried in their lives. And they're smiling, not because they're happy, but because the blueprint told them to smile. The propaganda said, this would be glorious. The posters said, this would be quick. The general said the plan would work. And so they smile, and they wave, and they get on the train. And the train pulls away from the platform with that long, slow, mechanical exhale that trains have always had. A sound that, tonight, sounds less like departure and more like the world inhaling before it screams. The blueprint's mobilization chapter is always the same. It always takes too long. The trains are always late. The equipment is always slightly wrong. Boots that don't fit, rifles that jam, food that tastes like it was packed by someone who had never actually eaten food. And the men, the millions and millions of men, are always younger than you'd expect. They're 18, 19, 20. They have pimples. They miss their mothers. They don't know how to shave properly. And they've been told by every authority figure in their lives that what they're about to do is necessary and noble and temporary. In the corner of the supply depot, behind a crate of regulation socks, the rat has found a new home. The rat has no opinion on mobilization. The rat has noticed that military supply depots contain a significantly higher volume of crumbs than civilian kitchens, and considers this development a net positive for its species. The rat, in its own way, is mobilizing too. Let's talk about food, because the blueprint, for all its grand strategic ambition, runs on calories, and the calories, historically, are terrible. Feeding an army is one of those problems that sounds solvable in theory and becomes nightmarish in practice. You need to provide 3 meals a day to several million people, most of whom are located in places with no kitchens, no refrigeration, no grocery stores, and no Uber Eats. And you need to do it every single day, without interruption, for years. The solution across every major war has been roughly the same. Take food that is cheap, durable, and resistant to spoiling. Pack it into containers that are heavy and difficult to open, and ship it to the front, where it will arrive late, damaged, and tasting like a regretful decision someone made in a canning factory 9 months ago. In World War I, the staple diet of a British soldier was bully beef, tinned corned beef that had the texture of wet cardboard and the flavor of a grudge. It came in a tin that required a special key to open, and the key broke roughly 60% of the time, which meant that the average soldier spent more time fighting his lunch than fighting the enemy. There was also hardtack, a biscuit so dense, so dry, and so impervious to the human jaw that soldiers used it as a building material, a plate, and, in desperation, a weapon. There was tea, which was brewed in anything available: helmets, shell casings, tin cups that had previously held boot polish, and which tasted, according to surviving accounts, like hot water that had been introduced to the concept of tea leaves but had not been formally acquainted. In World War II, the Americans introduced the C ration and later the K ration, which were designed by nutritionists to provide a balanced diet in a compact package and were experienced by soldiers as a balanced combination of disappointment, confusion, and mild gastric distress. The K ration included a small chocolate bar that was intentionally made to taste bad, not as a manufacturing defect, but as a design choice, because the army was worried that if the chocolate tasted good, soldiers would eat it too quickly. This is the level of thought that went into wartime food. Someone, somewhere, in an office, deliberately made chocolate worse on purpose. The food chapter of the blueprint is consistent across centuries because the fundamental challenge never changes. You cannot make good food travel well, and you cannot make travel food taste good. The gap between what soldiers eat and what the people who sent them to war eat is, like most gaps in the blueprint, enormous and rarely discussed. The general eats fresh bread and butter in a farmhouse requisitioned as a headquarters. The diplomat eats Dover sole in a London club. The politician eats whatever his cook prepares in his official residence. And the 19-year-old in the trench eats bully beef out of a dented tin with a spoon he found in the mud. And if he's lucky, the rat hasn't gotten to it first. The rat, it should be noted, does not share the soldier's complaints about the food. The rat considers bully beef a delicacy. The rat considers hardtack a structural improvement to its nest. The rat is, by any reasonable metric, the most satisfied diner in the entire theater of war. Let's talk about what happens to your body when the blueprint puts you on a battlefield, because the blueprint section on health and hygiene was clearly written by someone who had never personally experienced either. You are standing, or sitting, or lying, or crouching in whatever physical environment the war has assigned you. In 1914, it's a trench. The trench is 3 feet wide, 7 feet deep, and stretches for hundreds of miles across France and Belgium like a scar drawn by a very angry god with a ruler. The bottom of the trench is mud, not the cheerful, squelching, boot-pulling mud of a country walk. This is a special kind of mud, a mud that has been mixed with rain, blood, sewage, decaying food, spent ammunition, and an unknowable number of rats, and has achieved a consistency somewhere between wet concrete and despair. You are standing in this mud. Your feet have not been dry in 11 days. Your boots, which were new 3 weeks ago, have developed a texture that suggests they are slowly becoming part of the mud, a merger that neither party requested, but both seem committed to. Your feet themselves have begun a process that the medical officers call trench foot, and that you would call, my feet are turning into something that should not be attached to a human body. Trench foot occurs when feet are submerged in cold, wet conditions for extended periods, and it progresses from numbness to swelling to blistering to, in extreme cases, gangrene, which is a word that, once you've smelled it, you will never need to look up in a dictionary again. The medical situation across every major war follows a pattern so depressing that it constitutes its own sub-blueprint. In the early stages, the primary threats are disease, infection, and the complete absence of anything resembling sanitation. More soldiers died of disease than combat in every major conflict before the 20th century. And even in the 20th century, the margin was uncomfortably narrow. The water is contaminated. The latrines are inadequate. The lice are endemic. They live in the seams of your uniform, in your hair, in your bedding, and in the quiet, itchy spaces between your skin and your dignity. The lice carry typhus. The contaminated water carries dysentery, typhoid, and cholera. The mud carries tetanus. The rats carry everything. And the medical response to all of this, for most of human history, has been variations on a theme of try not to think about it, combined with whatever medicines are available, which, depending on the era, range from almost nothing to something that might be worse than the disease. In World War I, the treatment for a shrapnel wound was surgery performed in a field hospital that smelled like carbolic acid, unwashed bodies, and the particular metallic tang of fresh blood. The surgeon had been awake for 36 hours. His instruments had been sterilized, probably at some point in the recent past, and the patient was given ether. if ether was available, ah no, or a bullet to bite on, which is a phrase that sounds like a figure of speech, but was, for millions of men, a literal description of their medical plan. And yet, and this is the warm pivot that the voice requires, the medical professionals who worked in these conditions were, without exaggeration, among the bravest people the blueprint ever produced. Nurses who volunteered for frontline service, knowing exactly what they'd see. Surgeons who operated for 20-hour stretches in tents that shook with artillery. Stretcher bearers who crossed no man's land under fire to bring back men they'd never met, knowing that the odds of both of them surviving the trip were roughly equivalent to winning a coin toss in a hurricane. The blueprint creates horror, but it also, incidentally and without intending to, creates heroism. And the heroism is always, always found in the people the blueprint considers expendable. Let's talk about the home front, because the blueprint doesn't stop at the battlefield. It follows the soldier's family all the way back to their kitchen table, sits down uninvited, and helps itself to whatever's left in the pantry, which, by year 2 of any major war, is not much. The home front is where the blueprint's effects are felt most intimately and discussed least honestly. It's the place where the posters and the speeches and the patriotic music bump up against the reality of an empty chair at dinner, a telegram you're afraid to open, and a ration book that tells you exactly how much sugar you're allowed this week and doesn't care that you're tired and frightened, and the answer is never enough. You're standing in a kitchen. The wallpaper is cheerful. Flowers or stripes or some pattern that was chosen during peacetime and now feels like it belongs to a different world. The table is set for fewer people than it was designed for. There's a photograph on the mantle of someone in uniform, and the photograph is both the most comforting and the most terrifying object in the house, because every time you look at it, you wonder whether the person in it still looks like that, or still looks like anything, or is still alive. The home front during World War I was an exercise in managed deprivation. Food was rationed. Fuel was rationed. Fabrics were rationed. Clothing became a matter of government policy, and hemlines were shortened not by fashion, but by necessity, which is probably the only time in history that the War Department had an opinion about skirt length. Women went to work in factories that had previously employed only men, operating machinery that nobody had trained them to use, making weapons they hoped would protect the sons and husbands whose jobs they were filling. The hours were long. The pay was bad. The conditions were dangerous. Munitions workers handled TNT with their bare hands, and the chemical exposure turned their skin yellow, earning them the nickname Canary Girls, which sounds almost cheerful until you learn what happened to their health. And through all of this, the home front was expected to remain cheerful. The propaganda demanded it. The government required it. Morale was a resource, like coal or steel, and it was managed with the same bureaucratic efficiency. Complaining was unpatriotic. Doubting was dangerous. Asking whether the war was worth it, whether the empty chair and the ration book and the yellow skin and the telegram were part of some larger purpose that justified the cost, was the kind of question that could get you reported, ostracized, or worse. So you didn't ask. You stood in your kitchen with your cheerful wallpaper and your photograph and your inadequate sugar ration, and you did what the blueprint asked you to do. You carried on. You carried on because the alternative was unthinkable. You carried on because everyone else was carrying on. You carried on because the blueprint had, over the course of months and years, normalized a situation that would have been unimaginable to the version of you who chose that wallpaper. And somewhere, in the corner of the pantry, behind the last tin of something that used to be peaches, the rat, or its domestic cousin, the mouse, had found its way into the house because the blueprint's effects are not limited to battlefields and factory floors. The mouse doesn't understand rationing. The mouse doesn't understand sacrifice. The mouse has found the sugar and is having a much better evening than anyone else in the house. Let's talk about letters, because in every war the blueprint has ever produced, the most powerful technology is not the cannon, or the tank, or the bomb. It's the pencil. A short, blunt, often borrowed pencil, pressed against a piece of paper that's been folded wrong by hands that are shaking from cold or fear or both, writing words that are simultaneously the most important and the most inadequate words ever committed to paper. The letter home is the blueprint's most human artifact. It exists in every war, in every language, in every hand, from the barely literate to the beautifully eloquent. It says, in 1,000 different ways and with 1,000 different levels of honesty, the same basic things. I am alive. I am thinking of you. I cannot tell you what it's really like here. I miss the things I used to take for granted. Please send socks. The letters from the front are always censored. There's an officer, tired, overworked, and profoundly uncomfortable with the task, who reads every letter before it's sent and blacks out anything that might reveal location, casualties, morale, or the truth. The result is a document full of absences, sentences that trail off into dark rectangles, paragraphs that skip from "the weather is fine" to "give my love to mother," with nothing in between but the shape of everything that couldn't be said. And the letters from home, the ones coming the other direction, are their own kind of fiction. They're bright and brave and full of news that has been carefully curated to sound like normal life. The dog did something funny. The garden is coming along. Mrs. Henderson's boy is doing well at school. The letter doesn't mention that the dog is thinner because the food is rationed. The letter doesn't mention that the garden is being dug up to plant vegetables because the shops are empty. The letter doesn't mention Mrs. Henderson's other boy, the one who didn't come home. Both sides are lying. Both sides know the other side is lying. And both sides continue the lie because the alternative, the raw, unfiltered truth about what is happening on both ends of the postal system, is something that neither sender nor receiver is equipped to survive. The letter is the blueprint's most humane invention, and its most tragic. It connects people across impossible distances, and it separates them with the thickness of a censor's marker. It says, "I love you," across a gap of 1,000 miles and 1,000 unsayable things. And somehow, impossibly, the love arrives intact, even when the words don't. In the mail sack, among the hundreds of folded, censored, tear-stained letters, there are crumbs. Someone packed biscuits in with the mail. The rat's cousin in the postal depot has already found them. Some things in the blueprint are constant. Let's talk about the people who said no, because the blueprint assumes compliance, and the people who refuse to comply are, in many ways, the most interesting characters in the entire story. Every major war produces conscientious objectors, people who, for reasons of religion, philosophy, or the simple and radical belief that killing strangers is wrong, regardless of what the government says, refuse to participate. The blueprint doesn't like these people. The blueprint has no page for them. They are a glitch in the system, a human variable that the alliance makers and arms builders and propaganda designers never accounted for. Because the blueprint assumes that if you make the cause noble enough and the enemy frightening enough, everyone will get on the train. But not everyone gets on the train. In World War I, conscientious objectors in Britain were called conchies and treated with a contempt that ranged from social ostracism to physical violence to imprisonment to, in the most extreme cases, being sent to the front anyway and subjected to conditions designed to break them. Some were tied to posts within range of enemy fire. Some were placed in solitary confinement for months. Some were sentenced to death, sentences that were commuted eventually, but not before the men had experienced the full weight of a system that considered their moral conviction a form of cowardice. In World War II, the treatment was marginally better. Conscientious objectors were given the option of alternative service, working in hospitals, farms, or fire services. But the social stigma remained brutal. Your neighbors knew. Your family knew. The woman at the shop who handed you your rations knew, and her silence was louder than any accusation. And yet, and this is the part that makes the blueprint's opponents so remarkable, they endured it. They endured the contempt and the isolation and the punishment because they believed, with a conviction that the blueprint itself could never generate, that there was something more important than compliance. They didn't have posters. They didn't have speeches. They didn't have the backing of governments or generals or newspapers. They had a principle, and they held on to it with the same stubbornness that the blueprint relies on in everyone else. The same human capacity for commitment, for loyalty to an idea, for refusing to budge even when the entire world is telling you to move. The blueprint produces war. But it also, inadvertently, produces the people who say that war is not the only option. And the blueprint has never figured out what to do with them, because you can't fight a person who has decided with absolute finality that fighting is the one thing they will not do. Let's talk about who gets rich, because the blueprint's dirty secret, or the one written in invisible ink on the back of every page, is that war is not an economic disaster for everyone. It is an economic disaster for most people. It is an economic catastrophe for the soldiers, the civilians, the small business owners, the farmers, the workers, and basically everyone who exists below a certain altitude of wealth. But for the people who exist above that altitude, the industrialists, the bankers, the resource extractors, the arms manufacturers, and the assorted opportunists who have always orbited the machinery of organized violence like remoras on a shark, war is a boom. The blueprint creates demand. Unprecedented, insatiable, government-backed demand for steel, rubber, oil, copper, aluminum, textiles, chemicals, food, medicine, vehicles, ships, aircraft, ammunition, and every conceivable supply that a modern army requires to function. And where there is demand, there is profit. And where there is profit, there are people who will structure their entire lives around making sure the demand continues. You can see this in every major war if you look at the balance sheets instead of the battle maps. During World War I, companies that manufactured explosives saw their profits increase by multiples that would make a venture capitalist blush. During World War II, American industrial output doubled, and corporations that had been struggling through the Depression suddenly found themselves swimming in government contracts so lucrative that the term war profiteer had to be invented to describe a phenomenon that had, in fact, existed for as long as war itself. The blueprint doesn't care about fairness. The blueprint is a system, and systems don't have morals. They have outputs. And the output of the war blueprint, in addition to the deaths and the destruction and the geopolitical rearrangement, is a transfer of wealth from the many to the few that is so consistent, so predictable, and so thoroughly documented that you'd think someone would have patched this particular bug by now. Spoiler, nobody has patched it. Nobody has even tried to patch it. Because the people who would need to approve the patch are, in many cases, the people who benefit from the bug. And the rat, our faithful, persistent, omnipresent rat, does not understand economics. But the rat has noticed that the warehouses are fuller during wartime than during peace, and the crumbs are more plentiful, and the humans are too busy to set traps. The rat, in its own way, is also a war profiteer. The rat would prefer not to be judged for this. Let's talk about the moment the blueprint breaks, because every blueprint has a flaw, and the flaw is always the same. The blueprint assumes that war, once started, can be controlled. It cannot. War is what happens when you light a fire in a room full of things you didn't know were flammable. You planned for the curtains to catch. You did not plan for the carpet, the furniture, the walls, the ceiling, and eventually the building next door. The turning point in every major war is the moment when the people running the war realize that the war is no longer running according to the plan. In World War I, the turning point came early, within weeks actually, when the Schlieffen Plan failed and the Western Front froze into a stalemate that would last 4 years and consume an entire generation. The generals had planned for a war of movement, cavalry charges, sweeping flanks, decisive battles. What they got was a war of attrition, mud, barbed wire, machine guns, and the slow, grinding, industrial destruction of human bodies at a rate that the word unprecedented was invented to describe. In World War II, the turning point was slower and more distributed. Stalingrad, El Alamein, Midway. A series of moments where the axis of conquest reached its maximum extension and began irreversibly to contract. The blueprint broke because the blueprint always breaks. It breaks because war is not a machine. It's a fire. And fire doesn't follow blueprints. Fire follows fuel. And the fuel of war, human rage, human fear, human grief, human stubbornness, is not something that can be measured in a staff meeting or calculated in a logistics report. The generals discover this. The politicians discover this. The diplomats who tried to prevent it discover this. And the ordinary people, the soldiers in the mud, the women in the factories, the children in the shelters, discover this most of all, because they are the fuel. They have always been the fuel. The blueprint uses them, and when the blueprint breaks, They are the ones left standing in the wreckage, blinking in the sudden silence, trying to remember what the world sounded like before the noise. Let's talk about the aftermath, because the blueprint's final chapter is also its cruelest. And it's cruel because it looks, from the outside, like an ending. But from the inside, it feels like the beginning of something nobody asked for. The war is over. Somebody has signed something. There are photographs of men in suits shaking hands, and the photographs look civilized and orderly, and the reality behind them is anything but. The aftermath of every major war is a landscape, literal and metaphorical, of things that used to be something else, cities that used to be cities, families that used to be families, countries that used to be countries. The map is being redrawn, which sounds like a bureaucratic exercise until you realize that redrawing the map means deciding which people belong to which country, which borders go where, which populations are moved, which populations are ignored, and which populations are, through the cold arithmetic of international negotiation, simply erased. You're standing in a city that has been bombed. The year is 1918 or 1945, or any year that follows a major conflict. The buildings have that particular look of destruction that is different from demolition. Demolition is intentional and precise. Destruction is chaotic and leaves behind shapes that were never meant to exist, jagged geometries of broken wall and exposed interior, rooms that are suddenly open to the sky, kitchens with no floor, bedrooms with no roof. There's dust. There's always dust. The dust of pulverized brick and concrete and plaster. The dust of everything that was solid becoming particles, becoming air, becoming the thing you breathe while you walk through the rubble of what used to be a neighborhood. The aftermath chapter of the blueprint includes the peace treaty, and the peace treaty is always, without exception, a document that plants the seeds of the next war. The Treaty of Versailles ended World War I and created the conditions, the economic humiliation, the territorial grievances, the seething resentment that made World War II not just possible, but in retrospect, almost inevitable. The settlement after World War II created the Cold War, the partition of Germany, the division of Europe, the nuclear standoff that would define the next half-century. Every peace treaty is a new page of the blueprint. Every ending is a beginning. Every never again is a not yet. And the people who sign these treaties, the diplomats, the politicians, the generals who have been promoted to statesmen, genuinely believe they are building a better world. They believe in the League of Nations, or the United Nations, or the European Union, or whatever institutional structure they've designed to prevent the next fire. And the institutions are real, and they do real good, and they are also, in the long arc of the blueprint, temporary. Because the blueprint is patient. The blueprint can wait. Let's talk about forgetting, because this is the blueprint's most powerful weapon, more powerful than any bomb, more effective than any propaganda, more dangerous than any arms race. The blueprint works because people forget, not immediately, not completely, but gradually, generationally. The sharp edges of memory become smooth. The specific horrors become general. The individual stories become statistics, and the statistics become history. And history becomes something that happened to other people, in other places, at other times. You're sitting in a classroom, The year is 20 years after the last major war. The teacher is talking about the war with the solemn, reverent tone that teachers use for subjects that are important but distant. The same tone used for volcanoes, ancient Egypt, and the water cycle. The war has become a unit. It has a test at the end. It has study questions and essay prompts and a documentary that the teacher shows on Fridays when the lesson plan runs short. And the students sit there, bored and fidgeting and thinking about lunch, while the footage plays. The black and white footage of explosions and marching and flags. And the footage looks old, and the people in it look old, and the whole thing feels like it happened on a different planet to a different species, because the students have never smelled cordite, or heard artillery, or seen the inside of a trench, or read a censored letter, or stood at a train station watching someone leave. The forgetting is not malicious. It's biological. The human brain is not designed to carry the weight of inherited trauma indefinitely. It is designed to process, to soften, to abstract, and eventually to file away. This is healthy. At the individual level. At the civilizational level, it is catastrophic. Because the forgetting is what resets the blueprint. The alliances form again, because nobody remembers what happened when they formed last time. The arms race accelerates because nobody remembers where the last one ended. The propaganda works because nobody remembers being lied to. Or they remember, but believe the new lies are different. Better lies, truer lies. Lies told by the right people for the right reasons. And the diplomat sits in his leather chair, and the general opens his filing cabinet, and the factory starts its machines, and the newspaper prints its headlines, and the whole elaborate, terrible, beautiful, human machinery of war begins to turn again, greased by the amnesia that every generation mistakes for wisdom. The blueprint's most elegant feature is that it erases itself after use. Not from the archives are full. Not from the books are written. But from the gut, from the bone-deep, visceral, embodied knowledge of what war actually feels like, sounds like, smells like, tastes like. That knowledge dies with the people who carried it. And when it's gone, the blueprint is free to start again. Let's talk about the modern echo. Because if you've been listening closely, and you may or may not be, because you're in bed and your eyes are probably getting heavy, which is exactly as it should be, you might have noticed that the blueprint is not a historical document. It is a living one. The alliance system is still here. It has different names: NATO, the EU, bilateral defense agreements, strategic partnerships. But the architecture is the same. Countries promising to defend each other, hoping the promise itself prevents the need for action, and knowing, somewhere in the back of every diplomat's mind, that the promise might one day be called in. The arms race is still here. It has moved from battleships to hypersonic missiles, from tanks to autonomous drones, from poison gas to cyber weapons. The technology is incomparably more sophisticated, but the logic is identical. Build more than they have, build faster than they build, and hope that the sheer volume of destructive capacity on both sides creates a kind of peace. A peace built on terror, which is like building a house on a foundation of dynamite and calling it stability. The propaganda is still here. It has moved from posters to algorithms, from newspapers to news feeds, from government-controlled radio to the decentralized, hyper-targeted, emotionally optimized content delivery systems that live in your pocket and know more about your psychological vulnerabilities than your therapist does. The economic engine is still here. The arms industry is one of the largest sectors of the global economy. The lobbying budgets are astronomical. The revolving door between government and industry spins so fast that it generates its own weather system. And the trigger, the small, disproportionate, impossible to predict event that activates everything, is, as always, waiting. It's always waiting. A border incident, a cyber attack, a misinterpreted satellite image, a nervous operator who makes a split-second decision based on data that turns out to be wrong. The blueprint doesn't need updating. The blueprint was written in a language older than any nation that currently exists, the language of fear, of pride, of resource competition, of tribal loyalty, of the deep and ineradicable human conviction that safety comes from strength, and strength comes from weapons, and weapons come from the willingness to use them. This language doesn't change. The accent shifts, the vocabulary expands, but the grammar is the same. And the grammar says, build, ally, arm, fear, trigger, fight. In the modern world, with all its technology, all its institutions, all its accumulated wisdom, speaks this language as fluently as any medieval kingdom or imperial court or colonial outpost ever did. The blueprint is not behind us. It's beneath us. It's the floor we're standing on. And the rat, the eternal, omnipresent, completely nonpartisan rat, is still down there too, somewhere in the infrastructure, chewing on a cable that may or may not be important, completely unbothered by the implications. Let's talk about the people who survive, because the blueprint, for all its scope and all its destruction, has never managed to destroy the thing it was ultimately designed to exploit: the stubborn, irritating, gloriously irrational human insistence on continuing to exist. The blueprint assumes that people are resources. It counts them, mobilizes them, feeds them, badly, clothes them, arms them, deploys them, and when they are used up, replaces them. The blueprint treats human beings the way a factory treats raw material, as inputs to be processed, measured, and consumed. And the blueprint is, at a systemic level, correct. War does consume people. It consumes their bodies, their health, their youth, their sanity, their relationships, their homes, their plans, their futures, and in many cases, their lives. But it does not consume all of them. And the ones who remain, the survivors, the veterans, the widows, the orphans, the scarred and the broken, and the somehow still standing, are the blueprint's greatest failure, because they remember. They remember the mud. They remember the food. They remember the cold, the fear, the noise, the silence that followed the noise. They remember the names, the specific, individual, irreplaceable names of the people who didn't survive. And they carry those names forward into the amnesia, into the forgetting, and they say them out loud when the blueprint starts again, even though the world has stopped listening. The survivors are tougher than the blueprint gives them credit for. They are tougher than the generals who sent them, tougher than the politicians who declared the war, tougher than the industrialists who profited from it, and infinitely tougher than the propagandists who sold it. They are tough in the way that only people who have been through the worst thing can be tough. Not with bravado, not with anger, but with the quiet, unshakable knowledge that they have already seen the bottom, and they they are still here. They rebuild. This is the part that the blueprint never accounts for. They rebuild the cities, brick by brick, with hands that are shaking, and backs that are broken, and hearts that are carrying weights that no architectural plan can measure. They replant the gardens. They reopen the schools. They sit at tables that were empty and fill them again, not with the same people, because the same people are gone, but with new people, and laughter, and food that is, finally, edible, and wine that hasn't been rationed, and conversations that are not about survival, but about living. They do this every single time, after every war, after every catastrophe, after every chapter of the blueprint has been executed, and the blueprint has been filed away, and the next generation has begun the slow, inevitable process of forgetting. The survivors rebuild, and the rebuilding is not in the blueprint, because the blueprint was not written by survivors. It was written by planners, and planners, by definition, do not know what comes after the plan fails. Let's talk about the children, because the blueprint's longest shadow falls on people who weren't in the room when any of the decisions were made. You're small. The year doesn't matter. You're standing in a doorway that used to lead to a house, that used to be on a street, that used to be in a city, that used to be a place where people lived ordinary, unremarkable, coffee on Tuesday kinds of lives. You don't fully understand what happened. You understand the effects, the absence, the noise, the fear on adult faces, the way your mother's voice sounds different now, tighter, higher, like it's being squeezed through something invisible. You understand that dinner is smaller than it used to be. You understand that your father is gone, or your brother, or your uncle, and that the word gone means something different than it used to mean, something permanent and heavy and impossible to ask about, because asking makes the adults cry. The children of every major war grow up faster than biology intended. They learn things about the world that no curriculum includes. They learn that adults are not always in control, that safety is not guaranteed, that the house you live in can become a memory overnight, and that the word normal is not a fact but a feeling, and feelings change. They play in rubble. They collect shrapnel, the way other children collect seashells. They develop a sophistication about violence and loss that makes them simultaneously older and more fragile than their age suggests, like porcelain that has been repaired so many times that the glue lines are more visible than the original pattern. And yet, and this is the thing about children that the blueprint consistently underestimates, they also play. They play in the rubble and the wreckage and the aftermath, because play is not a luxury for children. It is a biological necessity, as essential as food or water or sleep. They invent games with the materials at hand. They build forts out of broken furniture. They chase each other through streets that are missing walls. They laugh, the specific, uncontrollable, hiccuping laughter of children who have found something funny in a world that is not. And the laughter is, in its own small way, a form of resistance. The blueprint cannot account for laughter. The blueprint cannot predict it, cannot prevent it, cannot profit from it. Laughter is outside the system. It is the human immune response to the blueprint's infection, and it works not by defeating the blueprint, but by proving that the blueprint has not defeated everything. Let's talk about the quiet parts, the moments between the chapters, the spaces between the events, the long, undocumented, historically invisible stretches of time when nothing happened, and the nothing was the whole point. Because the blueprint is written in events, assassinations, invasions, treaties, battles. But life is lived in the spaces between events, in the mornings where the only thing that happens is breakfast, in the afternoons where the only sound is a clock ticking and a dog breathing, and the wind doing something complicated with the curtains. The blueprint doesn't record these moments because they have no strategic value. They produce no intelligence, no casualties, no territorial changes, no headlines. They are, from the blueprint's perspective, irrelevant. And they are, from the human perspective, everything. You're lying in bed, not the bed you're lying in now, which we'll get to, but a bed in 1916, or 1943, or any year when the blueprint is active. The bed is narrow and uncomfortable, and possibly infested with something you'd rather not think about. But you're lying in it, and the shelling has stopped for the night, or the air raid siren hasn't sounded yet, or the trains aren't running until morning. And for this one moment, this brief, fragile, historically insignificant moment, there is quiet. And in the quiet, you think about things that have nothing to do with the war. You think about the taste of your mother's cooking. You think about a joke someone told you once that you can't quite remember the punchline to. You think about a person you care about and whether they're thinking about you. You think about what you'll do when this is over. Not if, when. Because thinking if is something you've trained yourself not to do. These thoughts have no place in the blueprint. They will not appear in any history book or military archive or diplomatic report. They are the private, interior, irreducibly personal moments that make up the vast majority of every human life, including lives lived during the worst chapters of the blueprint. And they matter more than everything else combined. They matter because they are the proof, the only proof that counts, that the blueprint, for all its power, has not reached the inside. It has taken the city. It has taken the food. It has taken the safety and the routine and the plans. But it has not taken the thought of your mother's cooking, or the half-remembered joke, or the quiet, stubborn, entirely irrational hope that when this is over, there will be a morning when the only thing that happens is breakfast. Let's talk about the one thing the blueprint never prints on any of its pages. The one element it never includes in its calculations. The one variable it cannot predict or control or weaponize. Love. Not the greeting card version. Not the cinematic version. Not the version that sells songs and novels and movies. The actual, unglamorous, inconvenient, physically uncomfortable love that exists between people who are sharing a foxhole or a ration or a letter or a silence. The love that makes a soldier share his last cigarette with a stranger because the stranger's hands are shaking, and a cigarette, in this context, is not a cigarette. It is the only gesture of kindness available in a landscape that has been systematically stripped of kindness. The love that makes a woman walk 3 miles in the rain to a telegraph office to send a message that says nothing more than still here. The love that makes a child draw a picture of a house with a chimney and a sun and two stick figures holding hands, and give it to a parent who has not smiled in weeks, and the parent smiles. The blueprint cannot account for this. The blueprint is built on predictable human responses: fear, greed, pride, loyalty, obedience, and love is none of these things. Love is unpredictable. It shows up where it's not supposed to. It persists when it shouldn't. It makes people do things that are, from the blueprint's perspective, completely irrational. Sharing food when there isn't enough, risking safety for someone who isn't strategically valuable, maintaining hope when every available piece of evidence suggests that hope is a waste of metabolic energy. And yet, love continues. Through every war, in every trench, on every home front, in every letter and every silence, and every small invisible moment between the events, it is the thing the blueprint was not designed to destroy, and the thing that, ultimately, outlasts every version of the blueprint ever written. The rat does not understand love. The rat understands warmth and food and the relative safety of dark corners. But the rat, pressed against the body of another rat in the dark, sharing heat in a space beneath the floorboards, where neither the shelling nor the cold can reach, is doing something that looks, if you squint, remarkably similar. Let's talk about music, because the blueprint, for all its cold efficiency, has a soundtrack. And the soundtrack is, depending on when you're listening, either the most stirring or the most heartbreaking thing you've ever heard. Every war has its songs. The songs before the war are triumphant. They're marches and anthems and stirring calls to duty set to melodies catchy enough that you find yourself humming them while you're doing the dishes, which is, when you think about it, a remarkable achievement for a piece of music whose primary purpose is to convince you that dying for your country is a reasonable Tuesday afternoon activity. The songs during the war are different. They start triumphant. The same marches, the same anthems, the same sturdy chest-thumping major keys. But as the months become years and the years become something that nobody has a word for yet, the music changes. The keys shift. The tempo slows. The lyrics stop talking about glory and start talking about home. There are songs about sweethearts left behind and mothers waiting by windows, and the specific, aching, impossible to describe feeling of missing a place so badly that the missing itself becomes a place. A country you live in that exists entirely inside your chest. You're sitting in a dugout. It's 1916 or 1944 or any year when the blueprint is at full volume, and someone who is exhausted and frightened and hasn't washed properly in a week and a half starts singing. It's not a good voice. It's not even a mediocre voice. It's the kind of voice that, in peacetime, would be asked firmly but politely to stop. But here, in the dugout, in the dark, with the guns rumbling somewhere above and the rats scurrying somewhere below, that voice is the most beautiful sound in the world, because it's human, and it's alive, and it's choosing, in a place where choices have been taken away, to make something that isn't destruction. Other voices join in, not in harmony. Harmony requires training and rehearsal and the kind of optimism that assumes you'll be alive long enough to practice. Just in unison, roughly, approximately, a collection of tired voices singing the same words at more or less the same time, and the effect is not musical excellence. The effect is communion. The effect is a room full of strangers deciding for 3 minutes to be something other than soldiers. The blueprint doesn't have a page for music. Music is not a strategic resource. It does not appear in logistics reports or ammunition inventories or the minutes of war cabinet meetings. And yet, music has survived every war the blueprint has ever produced, because music is the thing humans make when they have nothing left to make. No tools, no materials, no plan, no hope, just a voice and a memory of a melody, and the stubborn, irrational, gloriously human impulse to fill silence with something that sounds, even temporarily, even imperfectly, like meaning. The songs after the war are the quietest of all. They're not marches anymore. They're elegies. They're folk songs sung in living rooms by people who were there. And the songs don't explain what happened, because what happened cannot be explained in a 3-minute folk song. But they record a feeling, and the feeling persists long after the last person who felt it firsthand has stopped singing. And the rat, who has heard all the songs, the marches, the laments, the dugout hymns, the folk song elegies, has no opinion on any of them. The rat has noticed that people who are singing are less likely to be paying attention to their food, which is, from the rat's perspective, the only relevant musical criticism. Let's talk about the women, because the blueprint was written as if women don't exist, and the women have responded to this oversight by doing approximately 90% of the work required to keep civilization functioning, while the blueprint is busy destroying it. The blueprint's pages are filled with generals and diplomats and soldiers and politicians, men, almost exclusively, who make decisions in rooms where women are not invited, about wars that women did not choose, which produce consequences that women are expected to manage, absorb, survive, and clean up after. The women run the factories. When the men leave for the front, the women walk into the munitions plants, and the shipyards, and the steel mills, and the aircraft assembly lines, and they do the work. The same work that, 6 months ago, they were told they were biologically incapable of performing. They lift the crates. They operate the lathes. They weld the seams. They build the bombs, the bullets, the tanks, the planes, the ships. And they do it for less money, less recognition, and less protective equipment than the men who did it before them. Because the blueprint's economics, like its authorship, were not designed with women in mind. The women run the hospitals, not just as nurses, although the nurses of every major war are, by any honest accounting, among the bravest people the blueprint has ever failed to properly credit, but as administrators, organizers, and de facto logisticians who keep field hospitals operational in conditions that would make a supply chain consultant weep into his spreadsheet. They sort the wounded. They prioritize treatment. They hold the hands of boys who are dying and tell them that everything will be all right, which is a lie. And they know it's a lie. And the boy probably knows it's a lie. And the lie is still the most generous and most necessary thing either of them will do that day. The women run the homes, which sounds small until you consider what running a home means during a war. It means feeding a family on rations designed by someone who has never actually cooked a meal. It means mending clothes that cannot be replaced because the factories that used to make civilian clothing are now making uniforms. It means explaining to a child why their father is gone without using any of the words that would make the explanation true. It means maintaining, through sheer force of will and an almost supernatural talent for improvisation, the appearance of a normal life in conditions where normal has been shelled, rationed, blacked out, and relocated to a bomb shelter. And the women, when the war is over, are expected to give it all back. The factories, the jobs, the authority, the independence, the sense of purpose and competence and participation in the world beyond the kitchen. The men come home, the ones who come home, and the women are expected to return to the lives they had before the blueprint activated, as if the years of running civilization were a temporary hobby, a wartime quirk, a thing to be folded up and put away like a ration book that's no longer needed. Some of them do. Many of them do not. And the ones who do not, the ones who look at the blueprint and say, quietly, firmly, and with the particular authority of someone who has welded an aircraft wing and is not inclined to be told she can't open a bank account, are the beginning of a different story. A story the blueprint did not write, did not anticipate, and does not know how to control. The rat, for its part, has never observed a gender-based division of labor among its own species. Both male and female rats scavenge with equal enthusiasm. The rat considers this sensible. Let's talk about coming home, because the blueprint has no chapter for this. No instructions, no logistics, no plan. And the absence is the cruelest thing the blueprint has ever done. The war is over. You've survived. You're standing on a platform again. A different platform than the one you left from, or possibly the same one. But it looks different now, because you look different now. And things that haven't changed have a way of looking unrecognizable when you're the thing that's changed. You're thinner. You're older. Not by the number of years that have passed, which might be 2 or 3 or 5, but by some other measurement that doesn't appear on calendars, a unit of time that is counted in things you've seen and things you've done and things you cannot unsee or undo. You're wearing a uniform that used to fit differently, and you're carrying a bag that contains everything you own, which is not much, and everything you've experienced, which is too much. And on the platform, there are people waiting. They're holding signs, or flowers, or children who have grown so much that you don't recognize them immediately, and then you do. And the recognition hits you like a wall, because the child's face is the face of the world you left behind, the world you fought to protect, the world that kept existing without you while you were busy surviving somewhere else. Coming home is the blueprint's epilogue, and it's written in a language that nobody taught you to read. The house is the same. The street is the same. The dog is the same, maybe, or a different dog that has replaced the original dog. And nobody mentioned this in the letters, because there are things you don't put in letters. The bed is the same bed. Your bed, the one you dreamed about in the dugout, the one you described to strangers in the dark, the one that represented everything you were fighting to get back to. And you lie in it, finally, after years, and it's too soft. The ceiling is too still. The silence is too complete. You've spent so long sleeping in noise, artillery, engines, the breathing of 50 other men, the scurrying of rats. That real silence feels like a sound you don't recognize, an absence so total that it becomes a presence, filling the room with a nothing so loud that you can't sleep in the bed you dreamed about sleeping in for 3 years. The people around you are kind. They're trying. They ask questions you can't answer, and then stop asking questions, which is worse. They look at you with an expression that is halfway between relief and worry, and the worry is the part that stays in the room after they leave, because the worry says, you're different, and you are different, and the world is different, even though it looks the same. And the gap between the world you came back to and the world you came back from is a distance that no train can cover, no letter can bridge, and no amount of time will completely close. The blueprint did this. The blueprint took a person and sent them through a machine and returned them to a world that didn't know how to receive them. And then the blueprint moved on, because the blueprint is already working on the next edition. The blueprint doesn't do aftercare. The blueprint doesn't have a customer service department. The blueprint produces wars and then walks away, leaving the cleanup to the people it damaged, the families it fractured, the communities it drained, and the veterans who lie awake in beds that are too soft, listening to silence that is too loud, trying to remember what normal felt like before the blueprint taught them what normal wasn't. And yet, because there's always an and yet, because humans are unreasonable and beautiful and incapable of surrendering even when surrender would be the rational choice, they do come home. They do lie in the bed. They do, eventually, learn to sleep in the silence. Not the same way they slept before, not with the same innocence or the same ease, but they sleep, and that counts. In the quiet mathematics of human survival, sleeping in your own bed after the blueprint tried to take your bed away from you, that counts as a victory, a small one, a quiet one, the kind nobody gives you a medal for, but a victory nonetheless. Let's talk about why the blueprint persists, because after everything we've walked through tonight, the alliances and the arms races and the propaganda and the triggers and the trenches and the letters and the forgetting and the rebuilding, the question remains, why? Why does a species that has walked through this fire so many times keep building the fire again? And the answer, which is both unsatisfying and true, is that the blueprint persists because it is built from the same materials as everything good about us. The alliances come from our need for community. The arms come from our need for safety. The propaganda comes from our need for meaning. The mobilization comes from our willingness to sacrifice for something larger than ourselves. The trigger works because we care, because we have values and borders and things we are willing to defend. Every page of the blueprint is a corruption of something decent. Every mechanism of war is a perversion of something that, in another context, would be called virtue. The blueprint turns loyalty into tribalism. It turns courage into aggression. It turns love of country into hatred of the other. It takes the best things inside us, our capacity for cooperation, for commitment, for endurance, for hope, and redirects them toward destruction. And the reason we fall for it, every time, is not because we're stupid or forgetful or incapable of learning. It's because the blueprint speaks the language of our deepest instincts, and those instincts are not wrong. They're just being used by the wrong system for the wrong purpose. The need for safety is real. The need for community is real. The need for meaning is real. The blueprint doesn't create these needs. It hijacks them. And a hijacking only works when the vehicle is real, when the feelings being exploited are genuine, when the fears being amplified are legitimate, when the loves being weaponized are true. The blueprint persists because we are, at our core, the kind of creatures who will run into a burning building to save a stranger. And the blueprint has figured out how to start the fire and then hand us the matches and tell us it's heroism. This is not a comfortable truth. It is not a lesson with a tidy moral. It is just the truth stated plainly in the quiet of your room at the end of a very long night. The blueprint is us, not the worst of us, not some alien force imposed from outside. Us, our loyalty, our fear, our love, turned inside out and pointed at the wrong target. And the only defense against the blueprint, the only one that has ever worked, even partially, even temporarily, is awareness. Not intelligence, not education, not institutions or treaties or technology. Awareness. The simple, difficult, endlessly renewable act of looking at the blueprint and saying, I see you. I know what you are. And I choose, this time, not to follow the instructions. So here you are, still breathing, still warm, still unmistakably alive, after a night spent inside the longest, most dangerous instruction manual humanity has ever written. You've stood in the Alliance room with its maps and its flags. You've watched the arms race from the factory floor, next to a rat who had better priorities. You've sat in the cafe before the trigger, drinking coffee that you didn't know was your last cup of normal. You've stood on the train platform during mobilization. You've eaten the bully beef. You've smelled the trench. You've read the censored letter and written the cheerful reply. You've walked through the rubble and heard the laughter of children playing in the wreckage. You've been through every page of the blueprint, and you made it out. And the people who actually lived these pages, the real ones, the ones whose names fill the archives and the cemeteries and the faded photographs on mantels and houses that may or may not still be standing, they deserve something more than a history lesson. They deserve to be remembered as what they were. People, not statistics, not chapters in a textbook. People who loved and feared and hoped and complained about the food and missed their families and told bad jokes in impossible circumstances and found ways to be kind when kindness was the most impractical and most necessary thing in the world. They were tougher than the blueprint gave them credit for. They were funnier than the history books suggest. And they were, in every way that matters, exactly like you. And you, the actual you, the one lying in bed right now with the fan humming and the dark pressing gently against the windows. You are living in a world that the people in this story could not have imagined. You have clean sheets. You have a mattress that was designed for comfort, not endurance. You have antibiotics. You have running water, hot running water, available on demand anytime you want it, which is, by the standards of almost everyone who has ever lived, an almost offensive luxury. You have food in your kitchen that you chose, because you could, because the ration book is not a concept you have ever had to live with. You have a door that locks. You have a roof that holds. You have a pillow that was manufactured by someone who was thinking about your neck, not about a production quota for the war effort. Nobody is going to hand you a conscription letter tomorrow. Nobody is going to ask you to build a bomb, or eat bully beef, or walk through mud that smells like the end of the world. You are lying in a bed that billions of people across the span of human history would have considered a miracle. And the only thing being asked of you right now is to close your eyes. That's it. That's the entire assignment. You have the extraordinary, historically unprecedented privilege of lying in the dark and thinking about nothing more urgent than sleep. History teaches a lot of things, but the one that sticks, the one that settles into the bones and stays long after the dates and the names and the battle maps have faded, is this: humans are not fragile. We are not delicate or passive or helpless in the face of the systems we build. We are stubborn and adaptable and relentlessly, irrationally creative in our refusal to be crushed by circumstances that should, by every reasonable measure, crush us. We find humor in horror. We find connection in isolation. We find love in the wreckage. And we rebuild, not because we're optimists, but because rebuilding is what we do. It's the one page of the blueprint that nobody wrote, because nobody needed to. It was already there, inside us, before the blueprint existed, before the first alliance was formed, before the first weapon was forged, before the first flag was planted on the first map. The instinct to rebuild was already waiting, patient and quiet, and older than any war. So close your eyes. Let the weight of the blanket settle over you, like the last page of a very long book being gently turned. Let the fan fill the room with that steady, unchanging hum that sounds nothing like a factory, nothing like an engine, nothing like a train pulling away from a platform. It's just air, moving in circles, going nowhere, meaning nothing. And that meaninglessness is, tonight, the most peaceful sound in the world. The blueprint is in the archive. The maps are folded. The flags are put away. The generals are sleeping. The diplomats are sleeping. The factory is dark and the machines are still. The rat has found a warm corner and curled up with its tail over its nose, and even the rat is done for the night. You've walked through every page. You've seen every chapter. You've met the diplomat and the general and the factory worker and the soldier and the mother and the child, and you've watched them all do the thing that humans do best: carry on, against all evidence, against all reason, against all the instructions in the blueprint. And now, it's over. And you're here, in the quiet, in the dark, in the warmth, in the extraordinary, ordinary miracle of a night where nothing is happening and nothing needs to happen, and the only thing left to do is rest. Let the pages go. Let the history go. Let the blueprint dissolve into the dark behind your eyelids, where it can't reach you, where it has no power, where the only thing that exists is the sound of the fan and the weight of the blanket and the slow, easy, unhurried rhythm of your own breathing. Sleep well. The blueprint can wait. You don't have to. Good night.